Think slavery was a tragedy of the modern world? Think again. Long before plantations and colonial empires, slavery was already embedded in the foundations of ancient civilization. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't questioned. It was accepted as normal, as necessary, as the cost of the empire. And for those in power, it was not just a system. It was a right, a pillar of wealth, a definition of superiority. Let's begin in ancient Egypt, one of the world's oldest and most enduring civilizations. The grand temples of Luxor and Karnak, the massive pyramids of Giza, the golden tombs of the pharaohs, these wonders didn't rise by divine power. They were built with human suffering. Slavery in Egypt wasn't based on race. It was about conquest and hierarchy. Foreigners, prisoners of war, captured Nubians, Libyans, and Asiatics were dragged back to Egyptian cities and temples, branded as spoils of victory. They became chattel. The state claimed ownership over their bodies. They dug canals, built monuments, farmed state lands, and served in temples. Many were sent to the gold mines in Nubia, a death sentence in all but name. Conditions were brutal: suffocating heat, no sanitation, and endless labor. Skeletons from these sites show emaciation, fractures, and signs of violent trauma. These people were not citizens, they were tools. Even children weren't spared. Some records mention the use of young boys to crawl into narrow mining shafts adults couldn't reach, exposing them to toxic dust and sudden collapses. In households, slaves might perform domestic tasks: cleaning, grinding grain, caring for children. Some even rose to trusted positions. But make no mistake, they had no rights. They couldn't own property, marry freely, or refuse commands. And if they did resist, punishments ranged from beatings to mutilation. Egyptian iconography sometimes depicts slaves being beaten by overseers, evidence not just of violence, but of institutionalized brutality. Temples, too, were sustained by slave labor. Massive religious complexes weren't simply built by slaves, they were maintained by them. Some temples held hundreds of enslaved workers tasked with preparing food, weaving linens, or brewing beer for rituals. These sacred centers depended on the very people considered profane by their hierarchies. Slave labor wasn't an exception, it was an administrative category in temple records, often mentioned alongside livestock and grain stores. And Egypt was not alone in this. Across the Red Sea and into Mesopotamia, slavery formed the basis of economic and administrative life. In cities like Babylon and Ur, enslaved people were recorded in legal codes like Hammurabi's. There were distinctions between debt slaves and prisoners of war, but both lived under systems that permitted corporal punishment and family separation. Debt slavery, in particular, ensnared entire families for generations. Now shift to Greece, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and art. But beneath its shining marble lies a darker truth. The city-state of Athens, famed for its intellectual legacy, was home to tens of thousands of slaves. By some estimates, slaves made up a third of the population. Democracy was for citizens, but slaves had no voice. Slavery was woven into every aspect of life. In the silver mines of Laurion, men and boys, many of them slaves, were forced into narrow tunnels, breathing metallic dust, working in darkness. Conditions were so deadly that lifespans plummeted. Their labor funded Athens' golden age. And in the home, enslaved women served as nurses, cooks, and concubines. Sexual exploitation wasn't rare, it was systemic. These women were not only laborers, they were silenced victims in a household hierarchy designed to render them invisible. Unlike in Egypt, some Greek slaves could be freed and even become citizens in rare cases. But freedom was precarious. Most were seen as property. Philosophers like Aristotle justified slavery as natural, claiming that some people were born to serve. This wasn't fringe thinking, it was mainstream. Even Plato never called for the abolition of slavery, it was too embedded, and so the great minds that shaped Western thought did so while surrounded by and dependent on unpaid, unfree labor. And what of Sparta? Its helots, enslaved people native to the region, lived in constant fear. They outnumbered their Spartan masters, but were kept in check through state-sanctioned terror. Every year, young Spartan men were sent out to kill helots as a form of initiation. It wasn't just tolerated, it was tradition. Helots worked the land, providing the food that fed the Spartan warrior elite. But they did so under constant surveillance, and with little hope of relief. Historical records suggest they were regularly humiliated, forced to wear degrading clothing and made examples of in public. This wasn't just labor, it was a subjugation designed to strip away humanity. Now to Rome, the empire that built roads across Europe, aqueducts across continents, and monuments that still stand today. Rome was powered by slavery. At its peak, up to 40% of the population in Italy were enslaved. Slaves fought in the Colosseum, served senators, farmed vast estates, and rowed warships. A Roman slave could be a Greek tutor, a Gallic farmhand, a Syrian cook, or a captured warrior from Britannia. Some were literate, some were architects, doctors, or accountants, but all were legally property. Owners could whip them, chain them, starve them, or kill them without consequence. The law offered no protection. Punishments were often public and designed to instill fear. Runaways could be branded or crucified. If a master was murdered, Roman law dictated that all his household slaves be executed, guilty or not. In one recorded case, over 400 slaves were killed after a single assassination. Sexual abuse was rampant. Enslaved women were especially vulnerable. Roman masters could demand anything, and refusal was not an option. Enslaved men were not spared either. Abuse crossed all boundaries. There were slave revolts, most famously that of Spartacus, a gladiator who led a massive rebellion. For 2 years, he and his followers challenged Roman forces. But Rome responded with overwhelming violence. Crucifixions lined the Appian Way. Over 6,000 bodies left as a message. Rebellion would not be tolerated. But even beyond the battlefield, slavery corroded the soul of society. It taught Romans that some lives mattered less, that brutality was acceptable, that silence, obedience, and submission were virtues. These ideas didn't die with the empire. They echoed forward. Slavery wasn't simply a condition. It was a machine, a vast, brutal engine that powered economies, fed armies, and upheld class divisions. And across Egypt, Greece, and Rome, this engine was fueled by violence and fear. Across these civilizations, a common thread emerges. Slavery was normalized. It wasn't just tolerated, it was praised. Pharaohs listed their captives as signs of divine favor. Greek writers described ideal slaves in moral treatises. Roman elites boasted about the numbers they owned. And what of the enslaved themselves? Their voices rarely survive. We have their words of kings, generals, and philosophers, but few from those who carried the stones, who fed the fires, who died unnamed. Their lives were lived in shadows, their stories mostly erased. And this silence was no accident. Societies that depended on slavery had no interest in remembering the pain of those they exploited. Slavery was embedded not just in the economy, but in the very world view of ancient elites. They didn't hide it. They celebrated it. Temples were inscribed with the number of slaves conquered. Statues and steles were erected not just to gods, but to generals and kings who brought back captives by the thousands. Entire architectural marvels, from Egyptian obelisks to Roman villas, were built to display power, and that power was extracted through human lives. And while a rare few slaves might gain favor or even freedom, their stories are exceptions. The rule was hardship, anonymity, and early death. Their labor laid the bricks of civilization, but their names were forgotten before the mortar dried. Even in death, there was no dignity. Most slaves were buried without ceremony, if they were buried at all. Their bones, scattered beneath the cities they built, became part of the foundations, unseen, unspoken, unmourned. The full scope of ancient slavery is hard to comprehend today, not just because of its cruelty, but because of how utterly commonplace it was. The ancient world did not question slavery. It depended on it, economically, politically, culturally. Today, we walk through ancient ruins and marvel at their grandeur, but beneath the stone, lies blood. The horrific truth of ancient slavery isn't just in the whips and chains, it's in the silence that followed, the acceptance, the indifference. The world we inherited was built on that foundation. Still think ancient history was glorious? Look closer. It was built on backs that bent and broke.